Have you ever felt like something isn't quite right with the world? Like there's an invisible force shaping your choices, guiding your thoughts, and controlling what you see. You wake up, go to work, scroll through your phone, watch the news, cast your vote, and feel like you're in control. But are you? Is this freedom, or just the illusion of it? What if I told you that many of the decisions you make every day aren't really yours? That the choices you're given, your political beliefs, the news you consume, the information you trust have already been pre-selected for you? You might think, that sounds like a conspiracy theory. But history has shown us time and time again that the most effective form of control is the one you don't even notice. And that's exactly what George Orwell warned us about. Orwell's 1984 isn't just a dystopian novel, it's a blueprint for how power manipulates perception, how governments and corporations manufacture consent, and how societies willingly surrender their freedoms without ever realizing what they've lost. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most important and terrifying questions of our time. Are we truly free? Or have we become prisoners of a carefully crafted narrative? In this video, we'll expose the hidden mechanisms that shape your reality, how history is rewritten, how language is weaponized, how social pressure enforces compliance, and most importantly, how the illusion of freedom is maintained. We'll explore the stories that keep people trapped, the false choices that pacify them, and the creeping authoritarianism disguised as progress. But before we go any further, take a second to really think. Do you believe everything you've been told? Or is there a part of you that senses there's something more beneath the surface? If you're ready to challenge everything you thought you knew, then stay with me until the very end of this video, because what we're about to uncover might just change the way you see the world forever. Before we begin, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future deep dives like this. And if you want to support independent content that questions the status quo, consider dropping a super thanks or checking out the donation links in the description. Every bit of support helps keep this channel going, and more importantly, helps spread the truth. Now, let's begin. George Orwell's warnings in 1984 and Animal Farm have never felt more relevant than they do today. His depiction of a society under constant surveillance, where history is rewritten, and independent thought is criminalized, resonates deeply with the world we live in. The question is, are we truly free, or are we just experiencing the illusion of freedom? This is the philosophical paradox that Orwell challenges us to confront. Modern society prides itself on the idea of democracy and personal liberties. But when we take a closer look, we see the creeping influence of the very mechanisms Orwell feared. Governments, corporations, and media giants have gained unprecedented power to shape public perception, influence thoughts, and control narratives. While we may not have a literal big brother watching over us, we do have mass data surveillance, censorship disguised as content moderation, and a culture that discourages dissent under the guise of maintaining social harmony. Think about the way information is disseminated today. The internet was once hailed as the ultimate tool for free expression. But in reality, it has become a double-edged sword. Algorithms on platforms like Google, YouTube, and Twitter, now X, determine what information we see. Personalized feeds create echo chambers, reinforcing our existing beliefs while suppressing alternative viewpoints. Instead of engaging in open discussions, people find themselves trapped in ideological bubbles, where only one version of the truth is presented. Orwell warned about this in 1984 with the concept of doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both as truth. When we are only fed one perspective and are discouraged from questioning it, we become more susceptible to accepting falsehoods as reality. The rewriting of history is another Orwellian theme that is increasingly relevant. In 1984, the party controls the past, constantly altering records so that history always aligns with its current agenda. Today, we see similar patterns in how historical events are reinterpreted to fit contemporary political narratives. Statues are removed, books are banned, and controversial figures are erased from public discourse. This isn't to say that societies shouldn't reevaluate their past, but the danger lies in eliminating uncomfortable truths rather than learning from them. Orwell understood that controlling the past allows those in power to shape the future. And we are seeing this unfold in real time. surveillance is another disturbing parallel between Orwell's dystopia and modern reality. In 1984, telescreens monitor every action, ensuring that citizens never step out of line. Today, surveillance is more sophisticated but just as pervasive. Governments track phone calls, internet searches, and GPS locations. Companies like Amazon, Apple, and Google collect vast amounts of personal data, analyzing our habits, preferences, and even private conversations. The justification is always security and convenience. But the trade-off is that privacy has become a relic of the past. The most troubling part is that people willingly accept this level of monitoring. Just as Orwell predicted, the concept of, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, has been used to normalize mass surveillance, making resistance seem unnecessary. Orwell also warned about the dangers of language manipulation, which we see today in the form of politically correct speech, euphemisms, and media framing. In 1984, the regime uses newspeak to eliminate words that could be used to express dissent. Today, certain phrases are banned or replaced to align with political agendas. Words are carefully chosen to evoke specific emotions and shape public opinion. War is rebranded as peacekeeping. Censorship is called fact-checking, and propaganda is referred to as public relations. By controlling language, those in power control thought, limiting the ability to question authority. Groupthink and mob mentality are additional Orwellian themes that have become deeply ingrained in modern culture. Social media has amplified the tendency to conform, rewarding those who align with popular opinion and punishing those who dare to question the mainstream narrative. Cancel culture is a prime example of this. People who express controversial views, even if they are well-intentioned, are ostracized, their careers destroyed, and their reputations ruined. This is similar to the 2 minutes hate in 1984, where citizens are conditioned to direct their rage at designated enemies, reinforcing their loyalty to the party. In today's world, the targets change, but the mechanism remains the same. Outrage is manufactured, dissent is silenced, and fear keeps people in line. The most insidious part of Orwell's vision is that totalitarianism doesn't always come through violent means. Sometimes it sneaks in through gradual, seemingly reasonable steps. No government declares itself oppressive overnight. Instead, freedoms are eroded slowly, under the guise of protection or progress. Each step seems small and justifiable, but when viewed in hindsight, the accumulation is staggering. Consider how, after 9/11, mass surveillance was expanded through laws like the Patriot Act. At the time, the justification was national security, but those powers never fully disappeared. Similarly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, governments introduced unprecedented restrictions on movement, speech, and assembly. While many of these measures were necessary in the short term, they also set a precedent for state control that can be exploited in the future. What makes Orwell's work so powerful is that he didn't just predict government overreach, he also understood how ordinary people contribute to their own oppression. Fear, apathy, and blind trust in authority create an environment where tyranny can thrive. Most people assume that they would resist an oppressive regime, but Orwell challenges this assumption. Would we really stand up against injustice if doing so meant losing our jobs, our friends, or even our freedom? History suggests otherwise. The rise of authoritarian regimes in the 20th century was often enabled by a passive population that either supported or ignored early warning signs. Despite the bleakness of Orwell's vision, there is hope. Awareness is the first step in resisting manipulation. If we understand the tactics used to control us, we can begin to push back. This means questioning information rather than blindly accepting it, seeking out diverse perspectives, and engaging in open discussions. It means valuing privacy and advocating for policies that protect personal freedoms. It means recognizing the dangers of censorship, even when it seems justified. True freedom isn't just about having rights on paper, it's about actively defending them. Orwell once said, "The further a society drifts from the truth, the more it will hate those who speak it." This is why whistleblowers, journalists, and independent thinkers are often vilified. Speaking the truth is dangerous in a world built on deception, but it is also necessary. Orwell didn't write 1984 to depress us, he wrote it to warn us. The real question is, will we listen? Power and truth have always been intertwined. But Orwell's warning in 1984 forces us to confront a chilling reality. History is not an objective record of the past, but a carefully curated narrative controlled by those in power. The phrase, "Who controls the present controls the past, who controls the past controls the future," encapsulates the dangerous cycle of manipulation that allows governments, corporations, and institutions to rewrite reality to serve their agendas. The idea that history is a fluid construct, rather than an immutable set of facts, challenges our very understanding of truth. If the past can be altered, then how can we trust what we know? If those in power dictate the narratives of history, then do we ever truly learn from it? Or are we doomed to repeat it under different disguises? Throughout history, regimes have understood the necessity of controlling historical narratives. From the ancient Egyptian pharaohs erasing the names of their predecessors to totalitarian regimes of the 20th century revising textbooks to glorify their leaders, the pattern remains unchanged. The Soviet Union under Stalin perfected this technique, frequently editing photos to remove political dissidents, rewriting events to fit the party line, and erasing entire individuals from existence. Orwell, having witnessed this firsthand during the Spanish Civil War, understood that controlling history was not merely about controlling facts, but about shaping collective memory. If the population could be made to forget an alternative reality ever existed, then the new version of history became the only version. Fast forward to today, and we see this phenomenon manifest in more sophisticated and insidious ways. Governments exert control over the past by influencing the way history is taught in schools, ensuring that national narratives align with contemporary political interests. In the United States, debates over how to teach history, particularly regarding slavery, civil rights, and imperialism, expose the ongoing struggle over historical interpretation. In China, historical events such as the Tiananmen Square massacre are actively censored, and mentioning them online can result in government retaliation. By controlling what is remembered and what is forgotten, those in power shape the national consciousness, determining how people perceive their own identity and history. Technology has made this process even more efficient. In 1984, history was rewritten manually by workers at the Ministry of Truth. Today, the digital age allows for real-time erasure and modification of content on an unprecedented scale. Social media platforms, search engines, and major news outlets wield immense power in shaping what information is accessible to the public. Algorithms prioritize some narratives while suppressing others, effectively rewriting history in real time. When major platforms deplatform individuals or remove content under the guise of misinformation, it raises an uncomfortable question. Who decides what is true? If a historical event can be reframed or omitted from collective memory with a few lines of code, then how much of our understanding of the world is built on artificial consensus? A striking modern example of history being reshaped in real time is the shifting narrative around whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. Initially, many media outlets depicted them as traitors. Yet over time, public opinion has evolved, and their revelations about mass surveillance are now widely accepted as vital disclosures. However, the battle over their place in history is ongoing. Governments and media entities that initially condemned them now engage in damage control, reframing their actions in a way that aligns with political interests. This is the essence of Orwell's warning. Truth is not fixed, it is malleable, and those who control its narrative determine public perception. One of the most dangerous aspects of historical manipulation is that people rarely question the version of history they are presented with. There is a natural tendency to accept the reality we are born into without considering that it may have been carefully constructed. This passive acceptance makes society vulnerable to misinformation, as people assume that history books, news sources, and educational institutions exist to convey objective truth rather than to uphold the status quo. The problem is exacerbated when dissenting views are systematically silenced or ridiculed. If those who challenge official narratives are dismissed as conspiracy theorists, then the dominant version of history becomes unassailable, regardless of its accuracy. Consider how historical narratives are reshaped in response to political shifts. In wartime, governments often simplify complex conflicts into binary moral struggles, omitting inconvenient truths. In the aftermath of war, these narratives become enshrined as national mythology. The United States' involvement in Vietnam, for example, was initially justified as a fight against communism. But as public sentiment turned, history textbooks gradually revised their depiction of the war. Similarly, the way nations address their colonial pasts varies dramatically. Some acknowledge historical atrocities, while others gloss over them or justify them as necessary progress. The result is that different generations grow up with entirely different understandings of the same events. The ability to shape history extends beyond governments to corporations and media conglomerates. When a company like Disney, which owns a significant portion of global media, decides to remove content deemed culturally insensitive, it effectively alters how future generations perceive certain historical and artistic works. The motivation may be well-intentioned, but it still raises important questions about historical preservation versus revisionism. Should we erase problematic past works, or should we contextualize them as products of their time? Orwell's concern was not merely with the outright destruction of history, but with the quiet, gradual modification of it until no one remembers it was ever different. Perhaps the most Orwellian aspect of modern historical revisionism is how willingly people participate in it. In 1984, citizens engage in doublethink, simultaneously holding contradictory beliefs while accepting both as true. Today, we see a similar phenomenon in how people respond to new narratives. If a widely accepted fact from a decade ago suddenly becomes politically incorrect, people do not merely abandon it, they act as though they never believed it in the first place. This revisionist tendency is amplified by social media, where public opinion shifts rapidly, and dissent is met with immediate social consequences. As a result, many people preemptively conform to new narratives, erasing their own memory of previous beliefs. The consequences of historical manipulation are profound. If people lose the ability to access an unaltered record of the past, they lose the ability to learn from it. Without an honest understanding of history, society becomes vulnerable to repeating its worst mistakes. This is why Orwell saw history as the battleground for control. If the past can be rewritten to serve the present, then the future can be molded accordingly. When a society forgets past injustices, it cannot recognize when they are happening again. In an age where information is abundant but truth is increasingly elusive, the responsibility to question history falls on individuals. We must be skeptical of official narratives, seek out multiple perspectives, and recognize that the history we are taught is often shaped by those who benefit from it. Critical thinking is our only defense against Orwell's nightmare scenario, a world where truth is whatever those in power say it is. The greatest danger is not that history is rewritten, but that people accept its rewritten version without question. Orwell's warning was not merely about government propaganda. It was about the fragility of truth in a world where reality itself is negotiable. If we do not actively engage with history, question its sources, and challenge its revisions, then we surrender our ability to shape the future. And in doing so, we allow those in power to dictate not just what we remember, but what we believe. People rarely recognize when they are being controlled because the most effective form of oppression is not enforced by violence but accepted voluntarily. Orwell's insight in 1984 that people do not rebel because they do not realize they are oppressed captures a fundamental truth about human nature. The desire for security often outweighs the desire for freedom. This psychological paradox explains why societies willingly trade liberty for the illusion of safety, even when it means self-imposed limitations on thought, speech, and action. The terrifying reality is that totalitarianism does not always require brute force. It thrives when individuals internalize its rules and enforce them on themselves and each other. One of the key reasons why people comply with restrictions on their freedoms is the deeply ingrained human need for stability. Freedom, in its purest form, is chaotic and unpredictable, while control offers the illusion of order. The more fearful people become, whether due to political instability, economic uncertainty, or social unrest, the more willing they are to surrender autonomy in exchange for the promise of security. Governments throughout history have capitalized on this instinct, implementing measures that restrict liberties under the justification of maintaining peace. Once fear is instilled, compliance becomes second nature. People stop questioning authority, not because they are physically forced to obey, but because they believe disobedience will lead to chaos. Fear is one of the most effective tools of control because it overrides rational thought. Orwell understood that a population in a constant state of fear is far easier to manipulate than one that feels secure. When people are afraid, whether of crime, terrorism, disease, or social ostracization, they become more willing to accept restrictions that they would have otherwise resisted. The post-9/11 era is a prime example of this. The implementation of mass surveillance programs like the Patriot Act was justified as a necessary step to prevent future attacks. And the public, driven by fear, largely accepted it. People were willing to allow their privacy to be invaded because they believed it would make them safer. Even years later, when the extent of government surveillance was revealed by whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, many people shrugged it off, convinced that such measures were necessary or that it did not affect them personally. This mindset, "If I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear," is the essence of self-imposed oppression. It reflects a dangerous misunderstanding of freedom, equating it with innocence rather than autonomy. The issue is not whether an individual has anything to hide, but rather that the very act of being watched alters behavior. If people know they are constantly monitored, they begin to censor themselves preemptively, avoiding controversial opinions, limiting their speech, and conforming to the perceived expectations of those in power. This is not the result of coercion but of self-regulation, which is far more insidious because it eliminates the need for external enforcement. A society where people voluntarily suppress their own thoughts is far easier to control than one that must be kept in line by force. Cancel culture is a modern manifestation of this phenomenon. While originally intended as a tool to hold public figures accountable for unethical behavior, it has evolved into a mechanism for social control, where people fear speaking openly because of potential backlash. The internet, once heralded as the ultimate platform for free expression, has become a space where deviation from dominant narratives can lead to career ruin, social exile, or even personal threats. The result is widespread self-censorship. People do not need to be silenced by a government when they have already learned to silence themselves. Orwell's concept of thought crime, the idea that merely thinking something deemed unacceptable is a punishable offense, has found new relevance. In today's world, individuals preemptively edit their beliefs and statements, not because they genuinely agree with the prevailing ideology, but because the consequences of dissent are too severe. The erosion of free thought is further exacerbated by the growing dependence on technology. Every aspect of modern life, communication, banking, healthcare, employment, is now tied to digital platforms, and these platforms are governed by corporations that operate as the gatekeepers of acceptable discourse. Algorithms determine what information people see, shaping public perception without them even realizing it. If a particular narrative is deemed dangerous or incorrect, it can be buried in search results or outright removed. The power to control what is visible is equivalent to the power to control what is real. This is Orwell's Ministry of Truth in action, not through government decree, but through a silent, algorithmic reshaping of reality. People adapt to this new reality without resistance, often unaware that their perception of the world is being curated by unseen forces. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of voluntary compliance is how it extends beyond individuals to entire societies. When everyone around you accepts certain rules, it becomes increasingly difficult to question them. Humans are social creatures, and our behavior is largely dictated by the norms of the groups we belong to. This is why totalitarian systems rely on peer enforcement rather than just state enforcement. When people fear being reported by their neighbors, colleagues, or even family members, they become their own enforcers, ensuring that they and those around them conform. In 1984, children were encouraged to spy on their parents, and loyalty to the party was measured by one's willingness to betray those closest to them. While this may seem extreme, modern parallels exist. Social media has turned people into informants, where a single tweet or post can be unearthed years later and used as a weapon against someone. The expectation is not just to obey the rules but to actively police others who might step out of line. Once a society reaches this level of self-regulation, the need for explicit control mechanisms diminishes. Orwell's most prophetic warning was not about authoritarian governments imposing restrictions, but about people willingly embracing them. When individuals no longer require an external force to monitor their actions because they have internalized the expectations of the system, oppression becomes invisible. It becomes something that people justify, defend, and even enforce on themselves. This is why Orwell's vision remains so terrifyingly relevant, not because it predicts a future ruled by brute force, but because it reveals how control can become so deeply ingrained that people cease to recognize it as control. One of the most effective ways to counter this kind of control is to reclaim the ability to think critically. When people question narratives rather than blindly accepting them, they reclaim a piece of their autonomy. The problem is that critical thinking itself is often discouraged. Schools teach obedience rather than independent thought. Workplaces emphasize compliance over innovation. And social circles pressure individuals to conform rather than challenge prevailing ideas. Orwell understood that the suppression of dissent begins not with laws but with education. A population trained from childhood to avoid questioning authority will not resist when their freedoms are gradually taken away. Instead, they will rationalize it, believing that it is necessary, inevitable, or even beneficial. Breaking free from self-imposed chains requires a willingness to embrace discomfort. It means resisting the urge to comply out of fear. It means refusing to self-censor even when speaking out carries risks. It means recognizing when security is being offered at the cost of liberty and questioning whether the trade is truly worth it. The most dangerous form of oppression is the one people accept willingly. And the only defense against it is awareness. Orwell did not just warn against external forces of control, he warned against the internal ones. The subconscious submission that turns free people into prisoners of their own making. In a world where the lines between freedom and control have become increasingly blurred, the choice to think freely is the most radical act of all. Language is not merely a tool for communication, it is a mechanism for shaping thought, perception, and ultimately, reality itself. Orwell's concept of newspeak in 1984 serves as a chilling reminder of how those in power manipulate language to restrict thought and control societies. If certain words are eliminated, then the ideas they represent fade as well. By limiting the ways in which people can express themselves, governments and institutions can shape the very way individuals think, making it nearly impossible to conceive of rebellion, question authority, or even articulate dissent. This is not just a dystopian theory, it is a process that has been happening throughout history and is accelerating in the digital age. The most effective way to control a population is not through brute force but by shaping the way they understand the world. If people lack the vocabulary to express opposition, they cannot organize against oppression. This is the foundation of Orwell's newspeak, where words are systematically removed from the language to ensure that rebellion becomes unthinkable. Concepts like freedom and independence become obsolete because there are no words to describe them. In this framework, control is achieved not by silencing people outright but by ensuring they never develop the ability to challenge authority in the first place. This linguistic manipulation is not confined to fiction. In modern political discourse, words are often distorted to serve particular agendas. Governments, corporations, and media organizations routinely engage in euphemistic rebranding to make controversial actions more palatable. Military invasions are framed as peacekeeping missions or humanitarian interventions. Surveillance programs are labeled national security measures. Torture is rebranded as enhanced interrogation. These linguistic shifts are not accidental, they are deliberate attempts to reshape public perception. If an action is renamed in a way that obscures its true nature, then it becomes easier to justify and harder to resist. The public does not rally against an invasion if it is framed as a defensive maneuver. Nor do they protest mass surveillance if it is presented as a safeguard against crime. Language, in this way, becomes a tool of deception, influencing not just how people discuss events, but how they internalize and accept them. Censorship extends beyond political rhetoric and into digital spaces, where the control of language is more insidious than ever before. Social media platforms, which were once heralded as bastions of free speech, now play an active role in shaping what can and cannot be said. Under the guise of combating misinformation, harmful content, or hate speech, tech companies wield enormous power to determine which narratives are amplified and which are suppressed. This is not to suggest that all moderation is inherently sinister. Some forms of regulation are necessary to prevent harm, but the issue lies in who decides what is acceptable and why. When dissenting opinions are systematically removed instead of debated, the space for critical discussion shrinks. People begin to self-censor, not because they agree with the prevailing discourse, but because they fear the consequences of speaking against it. Orwell's thought crime, where even thinking the wrong idea is forbidden, becomes a reality when individuals recognize that certain viewpoints, even if valid, are simply not worth expressing due to the potential fallout. Language policing does not always come from governments. Often, it is enforced by the public itself. In an era of social media outrage and cancel culture, people act as enforcers of ideological conformity. A single misplaced word or phrase can result in personal and professional ruin. Fear of using the wrong terminology, even unintentionally, leads people to adopt sanitized, approved language, ensuring that only the dominant narratives survive. This creates an environment where people do not just avoid controversial topics, they actively reinforce the narratives that have been deemed acceptable, even when they do not fully believe in them. Orwell predicted this phenomenon, understanding that when people police their own speech, external enforcement becomes almost unnecessary. The shift in language is also evident in cultural and educational institutions, where historical events and social issues are reframed to fit contemporary ideological trends. Certain words and phrases are deemed inappropriate, not because they are inherently offensive, but because they do not align with the prevailing worldview. Classic literature is rewritten or removed entirely if it contains language that is considered outdated or problematic. While some of these changes stem from a genuine desire to be more inclusive, they also raise concerns about the erosion of historical accuracy and the ability to engage with difficult ideas. If people are shielded from uncomfortable truths, they lose the ability to critically analyze the past and learn from it. This is precisely why Orwell feared the control of language, because it is not just about words, but about shaping the way people think. Another modern example of linguistic manipulation is the way corporations and media outlets use language to soften the reality of economic disparity. Job cuts are described as workforce restructuring. Lower wages are framed as cost-saving initiatives. Gig economy workers are referred to as independent contractors, rather than underpaid laborers without benefits. These shifts are not just cosmetic, they affect how people perceive and accept systemic issues. If a term sounds less harsh, the problem it represents feels less urgent. This is the power of language. It does not just describe reality, it constructs it. One of the greatest dangers of linguistic control is that it can lead to moral relativism, where actions are judged not by their inherent morality but by the words used to describe them. If an oppressive regime brands itself as a democratic republic, people might overlook its authoritarian policies. If a war is labeled a defensive operation, its aggressive nature is obscured. When words lose their meaning, truth itself becomes subjective, and once truth becomes subjective, those in power can redefine reality however they see fit. Orwell understood that the erosion of language leads to the erosion of independent thought. And once that happens, people become easier to manipulate. The solution to this problem is not to abandon language evolution but to recognize when language is being weaponized. People must be vigilant in questioning why certain words are being changed, who benefits from these changes, and what ideas are being suppressed as a result. It is crucial to resist passive acceptance of linguistic shifts and to insist on clarity and honesty in discourse. When a term is replaced with something more palatable, we must ask, is this change making reality clearer, or is it distorting it? When an opinion is silenced, we must ask, is this truly harmful, or is it merely inconvenient to those in power? Orwell's 1984 was not just a cautionary tale about government overreach, it was a warning about the power of words. If language can be controlled, thought can be controlled. If thought can be controlled, behavior can be controlled. This cycle of control is not always enforced with violence or intimidation. Often, it is enforced through the quiet, gradual reshaping of language until people no longer realize they have lost the ability to think for themselves. To preserve freedom, we must protect language from becoming a tool of manipulation. The most effective way to fight back against linguistic control is to refuse to let others dictate the boundaries of what can and cannot be said. The moment we accept those boundaries without question, we begin to surrender not just our words, but our minds. People often believe they are free because they are given choices. But what if those choices were pre-selected to create an illusion of freedom? This is one of the most unsettling insights George Orwell explored in his writings: how people can be controlled without realizing it, simply by limiting the options available to them. True freedom does not just mean having multiple choices, it means having the ability to shape and define those choices. If a person can only choose between two paths, both of which led to the same destination, are they truly free? Orwell understood that the most effective way to control a society is not through brute force but by shaping the boundaries within which people believe they are making independent decisions. In modern democracies, one of the clearest examples of this illusion of choice is the two-party political system. Many people believe that by voting for one party over the other, they are exercising their freedom and influencing the direction of their country. However, in many cases, both parties are part of the same overarching system, controlled by similar economic and corporate interests. Regardless of which party is in power, major policies, especially those concerning foreign affairs, corporate regulations, surveillance, and defense spending often remain unchanged. The illusion of choice pacifies the population, making them feel as though they have agency when, in reality, their decisions are confined within a narrow range of acceptable outcomes. This is why voter turnout often declines. People sense, even if they cannot articulate it, that their votes may not make as much difference as they are led to believe. Beyond politics, this illusion extends to nearly every aspect of modern life. One of the most pervasive examples is how social media and online platforms manipulate our choices without us even realizing it. Platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok claim to offer users complete control over what they see. But in reality, powerful algorithms are making those decisions for them. These platforms analyze user behavior, preferences, and interactions to curate content that keeps them engaged for as long as possible. This means that instead of freely exploring different viewpoints, users are funneled into echo chambers where they are repeatedly exposed to ideas that reinforce their existing beliefs. The content they consume feels like a personal choice, but it is actually being shaped by artificial intelligence to maximize engagement and profit. This is a modern example of Orwell's warning about how people can be manipulated without realizing it, simply by controlling what information they have access to. Retail and consumer culture operate under a similar dynamic. Walk into any supermarket or browse an online shopping platform, and you will be presented with what appears to be a vast array of choices. Yet, many of those brands are owned by the same handful of multinational corporations. Whether you buy Coke or Sprite, Lay's or Doritos, Dove or Axe, you are ultimately giving money to the same parent companies. The competition is an illusion, designed to make consumers feel as though they are making independent decisions when, in reality, their money is flowing into the same corporate structures. This is an extension of the illusion of political choice, the sense that there is a diversity of options when, behind the scenes, the decision-making power remains concentrated in the hands of a few. The job market also reflects this illusion of freedom. Many people believe they have control over their careers, yet they are often forced to conform to a system that demands long hours, suppresses independent thought, and rewards obedience rather than innovation. From a young age, people are conditioned to follow a predetermined path: go to school, get a degree, find a stable job, and work until retirement. The idea of striking out on one's own or rejecting the corporate structure is discouraged, not because it is impossible, but because it challenges the established order. This is a modern reflection of Orwell's insight that control does not have to be enforced by external pressure. It can be embedded within the very structure of society, making people believe they are choosing their own paths when those paths have been carefully laid out for them. Even in matters of personal expression, people are often operating within invisible constraints. The internet was initially celebrated as a space where anyone could share ideas freely. But over time, it has become increasingly regulated, not just by governments but by private corporations that control what can and cannot be said. Content that aligns with mainstream narratives is boosted, while dissenting voices are suppressed, demonetized, or outright banned. Users believe they are participating in open discourse, but the playing field is heavily skewed. Orwell warned that true censorship does not always come in the form of government crackdowns. It can also emerge through societal norms, economic incentives, and self-policing, where people conform not because they are forced to, but because they fear the consequences of nonconformity. The concept of free will itself becomes questionable in a world where people's desires, preferences, and behaviors are shaped by forces beyond their control. Studies in psychology and behavioral economics have shown that human decision-making is highly susceptible to nudging subtle influences that steer people toward particular choices. Everything from the layout of a store to the design of a website to the framing of a news article can shape how individuals think and act. People may believe they are making rational, independent choices, but much of what they decide is influenced by external forces that they are not even aware of. This is why Orwell's insight remains so powerful, because the most effective form of control is the one that goes unnoticed. The danger of living in a world where choice is an illusion is that it breeds complacency. If people believe they are free, they are less likely to resist or challenge the systems that confine them. They become passive participants in their own subjugation, accepting the status quo without question. This is why Orwell's warnings were so urgent, not because he believed totalitarianism would arrive through overt dictatorship, but because he understood that control is most effective when it is invisible. A society where people believe they are free but are actually operating within predetermined constraints is far more stable than one where oppression is obvious. When people do not realize they are being manipulated, they have no reason to resist. True freedom is not just about having choices. It is about having the ability to define those choices for oneself. It is the ability to ask questions that are not pre-approved, to seek knowledge beyond what is provided, and to challenge the structures that dictate what is and is not possible. Orwell understood that as long as people accept the reality they are given without questioning who constructed it, they will remain in a state of controlled perception. The challenge, then, is to recognize the limits of our choices and to push beyond them. To refuse to accept the world as it is presented to us and to insist on shaping it for ourselves. Only then can we begin to escape the invisible constraints that define our existence. Every society is built on stories, from the ancient myths of gods and heroes to the modern narratives of democracy, capitalism, and human rights. These stories shape how we understand the world, how we define ourselves, and what we are willing to fight for. They give meaning to our existence, provide order to chaos, and create a shared identity among people who might otherwise have little in common. The power of stories is immense, but their danger lies in their ability to control perception. When a story is accepted as an absolute truth, any challenge to it is seen not as an alternative viewpoint but as a threat. This is how people become prisoners of the narratives they believe in, trapped within the boundaries of what they have been taught. Often without realizing there could be a different perspective. History is shaped by those who tell the best story, not necessarily those who tell the truth. Victors write history, framing events in ways that justify their actions while portraying the defeated as villains or footnotes. Wars are never fought purely for conquest or power. They are always justified through noble-sounding reasons: freedom, security, defense, or the protection of civilization. Every nation presents itself as the protagonist of its own historical narrative, emphasizing its struggles, sacrifices, and moral superiority while downplaying its mistakes and wrongdoings. The American Revolutionary War is remembered as a fight for liberty, but less often discussed is how many loyalists, Native Americans, and enslaved people saw it as an elite power struggle that did little to change their own oppression. World War II is widely seen as the triumph of good over evil. Yet this narrative often glosses over the war crimes committed by the victorious nations. The Vietnam War is remembered differently depending on who tells the story. American textbooks focus on the Cold War context, while Vietnamese accounts emphasize their struggle against imperialism. The same historical event can take on radically different meanings based on which perspective is given prominence. People do not just inherit these stories, they internalize them. From a young age, individuals are taught to see the world through the lens of their culture's dominant narratives. Religion, education, media, and family all reinforce certain worldviews, creating a framework through which individuals interpret reality. A child born in a deeply religious society will see moral and existential questions through the lens of faith, while a child raised in a secular, scientific community will approach those same questions differently. These narratives are so deeply embedded in identity that challenging them feels like an attack on one's sense of self. This is why ideological debates often become emotional and hostile, because questioning someone's belief system is perceived as questioning their very existence. The power of stories extends beyond history and ideology into everyday life. People are constantly sold narratives about who they should be, what success looks like, and what will make them happy. The American dream is a prime example, a story that tells people that anyone can achieve success through hard work and determination. While this narrative has inspired millions, it also serves as a tool for control. It shifts responsibility entirely onto the individual, suggesting that systemic barriers like wealth inequality, racism, and access to education are irrelevant. If someone fails, it is because they did not work hard enough, not because the system is rigged against them. This kind of storytelling keeps people striving within a predefined framework, believing they are free while failing to recognize the constraints placed upon them. Political narratives function in much the same way. Every political movement constructs its own mythology, defining itself as the force of righteousness while casting opponents as dangerous extremists. This binary thinking creates an us versus them mentality, where dialogue and compromise become impossible. If one side believes they are defending democracy while the other sees themselves as fighting against tyranny, neither will entertain the possibility that they could both be manipulated by larger forces at play. This is how political division becomes self-sustaining, when people become so invested in their chosen narrative that they refuse to acknowledge any evidence that contradicts it. The result is a society where individuals no longer seek truth but rather the validation of their pre-existing beliefs. Social media has amplified this phenomenon to an extreme degree. Algorithms prioritize content that reinforces existing biases, trapping users in echo chambers where they are only exposed to information that aligns with their worldview. This creates the illusion that their beliefs are universally accepted while dissenting perspectives are dismissed as fringe or dangerous. The internet was supposed to democratize information, but in many ways, it has done the opposite. It has made it easier than ever to manufacture and reinforce powerful narratives, ensuring that people remain locked within their ideological bubbles. This is why conspiracy theories thrive online. They provide alternative stories that make people feel as though they are uncovering hidden truths, even when those stories are just as manipulative as the mainstream narratives they claim to reject. Cults, authoritarian regimes, and extremist movements all operate on the same principle. They construct a story that explains the world in absolute terms and demand unwavering belief from their followers. The most dangerous ideologies are not those that simply present an idea, but those that insist they alone possess the truth and that any deviation from their teachings is heretical. This is why totalitarian governments rewrite history books, control the media, and suppress dissent. They know that as long as people accept their version of reality, they will not question their rule. Orwell's concept of doublethink, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs and accept both as true, is a direct consequence of living within a controlled narrative. When people are constantly bombarded with conflicting messages but are discouraged from critically analyzing them, they learn to accept contradictions rather than resolve them. The most troubling aspect of this phenomenon is that most people do not realize they are caught within a constructed narrative. Because stories define perception, it is incredibly difficult to step outside of them. If all available information supports a particular worldview, then questioning it seems irrational. This is why people cling so tightly to their beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Changing someone's mind is not just about presenting facts, it is about breaking through the emotional and psychological framework that those facts must pass through. People will often reject uncomfortable truths not because they lack evidence, but because accepting them would require dismantling the story they have built their identity around. Recognizing this does not mean rejecting all narratives. It is impossible to live without some kind of guiding story. However, it does mean questioning where those stories come from, who benefits from them, and whether they accurately reflect reality. It means being open to new perspectives, even when they challenge deeply held beliefs. It means acknowledging that history, politics, and personal identity are all shaped by narratives that may not be entirely truthful. The greatest freedom is not found in choosing between competing stories, but in the ability to step outside of them and construct one's own. No one can fully escape the influence of societal narratives, but awareness is the first step toward intellectual independence. The ability to recognize when a story is being used to manipulate, divide, or control is essential for resisting the forces that seek to shape perception for their own ends. The most dangerous prisoners are those who do not know they are imprisoned. And the most effective chains are the ones people willingly place upon themselves. To be truly free is not to reject all stories but to reclaim the power to shape them on one's own terms. Orwell's work is often seen as bleak, a vision of an oppressive future where control is absolute and resistance is futile. But buried within the dystopian warnings of 1984 and Animal Farm is a more subtle message. Control is never truly complete as long as people are aware of how it operates. The idea that the human mind, once awakened, cannot be fully controlled is one of the most hopeful aspects of Orwell's philosophy. The very act of questioning authority, of recognizing manipulation, is itself a form of resistance. Governments, corporations, and ideological movements can rewrite history, restrict language, and punish dissenters, but they cannot fully erase the instinct to question and seek truth. This is why oppressive regimes always work so hard to crush free thought. They know that once a person begins to see the cracks in the illusion, the entire structure is at risk of collapse. Throughout history, some of the most significant social and political changes have been driven by individuals who dared to question the dominant narrative. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, dissidents, and intellectuals have always played a crucial role in exposing the lies that hold oppressive systems together. Figures like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, regardless of how they are perceived politically, have forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about surveillance and government overreach. Similarly, movements for civil rights, gender equality, and workers' rights have all been led by people who refuse to accept the status quo. The reason these figures are often vilified, imprisoned, or exiled is not because they are necessarily dangerous in a physical sense, but because their ideas threaten the carefully constructed narratives that those in power rely on. The ability to recognize manipulation is the first step toward breaking free from it. Orwell understood that the most powerful weapon against totalitarianism is not violence, but awareness. Awareness creates the possibility of choice. When people begin to see the mechanisms of control, how media shapes perception, how language can be weaponized, how history is rewritten, they gain the ability to resist not just externally but internally. They begin to develop what Orwell called crime stop, not in the 1984 sense of stopping dangerous thoughts, but in the real-world sense of preventing themselves from being manipulated into blind obedience. When a person questions the news they consume, examines the motivations behind political rhetoric, or refuses to be pressured into ideological conformity, they are engaging in an act of defiance. And these small acts, when multiplied across a population, create the foundation for broader resistance. Hope is not just found in grand, dramatic acts of defiance but in everyday decisions to think critically. The way people consume media, the way they engage in discussions, the way they react to pressure to conform, these all shape the degree to which a society is controlled. When people demand transparency from their leaders, when they support independent journalism, when they refuse to let fear dictate their actions, they are chipping away at the structures of control. No authoritarian regime has ever been able to fully suppress free thought, and no attempt to control a population has ever been entirely successful. Even in the most repressive societies, underground networks of resistance have always existed, whether through banned books, secret meetings, or coded messages. Technology, despite its role in surveillance and social conditioning, also provides avenues for resistance. The same internet that enables mass data collection also allows for the rapid spread of information. While major platforms can censor content, decentralized networks, encrypted communication, and independent media provide alternatives. The rise of blockchain technology, whistleblower platforms, and censorship-resistant forums suggests that as control mechanisms become more sophisticated, so too do the tools to evade them. This cat-and-mouse game between control and resistance is a testament to Orwell's belief that thought, once freed, cannot easily be recontained. Another source of hope lies in generational shifts. While older generations may be more entrenched in traditional narratives, younger generations, raised with access to vast amounts of information, often develop a natural skepticism toward authority. This does not mean they are immune to manipulation, far from it, but it does mean they are less likely to accept a singular version of reality without question. The increasing push for transparency in government, corporate accountability, and decentralized power structures reflects this broader trend toward skepticism of centralized control. Orwell's own life was an example of resilience in the face of oppression. Despite experiencing censorship, political exile, and health issues, he continued to write, to challenge, and to expose the dangers of authoritarianism. His work has endured not because it was mandated by any government or institution, but because people found truth in it. This is perhaps the most profound message of all: truth has a way of surviving, even against the most powerful efforts to suppress it. Ideas cannot be imprisoned in the same way people can, as long as there are individuals willing to challenge power, willing to document reality as it is rather than as those in power want it to be. There is hope. The fight against control is not won through a single revolution or a dramatic overthrow of power. It is won in the small moments when people choose to see rather than look away. It is in the refusal to accept convenient lies, in the courage to speak even when silence is safer, in the willingness to stand alone rather than blindly follow the crowd. Orwell's vision was dark, but it was not without light. The fact that his works are still read, still debated, and still influencing minds decades after his death proves that no system of control is absolute. Awareness is a form of resistance, and as long as people remain aware, the battle for freedom is never truly lost. Orwell's work is often seen as bleak, a vision of an oppressive future where control is absolute and resistance is futile. But buried within the dystopian warnings of 1984 and Animal Farm is a more subtle message. Control is never truly complete as long as people are aware of how it operates. The idea that the human mind, once awakened, cannot be fully controlled is one of the most hopeful aspects of Orwell's philosophy. The very act of questioning authority, of recognizing manipulation, is itself a form of resistance. Governments, corporations, and ideological movements can rewrite history, restrict language, and punish dissenters, but they cannot fully erase the instinct to question and seek truth. This is why oppressive regimes always work so hard to crush free thought. They know that once a person begins to see the cracks in the illusion, the entire structure is at risk of collapse. Throughout history, some of the most significant social and political changes have been driven by individuals who dared to question the dominant narrative. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, dissidents, and intellectuals have always played a crucial role in exposing the lies that hold oppressive systems together. Figures like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, regardless of how they are perceived politically, have forced the public to confront uncomfortable truths about surveillance and government overreach. Similarly, movements for civil rights, gender equality, and workers' rights have all been led by people who refused to accept the status quo. The reason these figures are often vilified, imprisoned, or exiled is not because they are necessarily dangerous in a physical sense, but because their ideas threaten the carefully constructed narratives that those in power rely on. The ability to recognize manipulation is the first step toward breaking free from it. Orwell understood that the most powerful weapon against totalitarianism is not violence, but awareness. Awareness creates the possibility of choice. When people begin to see the mechanisms of control, how media shapes perception, how language can be weaponized, how history is rewritten, they gain the ability to resist not just externally but internally. They begin to develop what Orwell called crime stop, not in the 1984 sense of stopping dangerous thoughts, but in the real-world sense of preventing themselves from being manipulated into blind obedience. When a person questions the news they consume, examines the motivations behind political rhetoric, or refuses to be pressured into ideological conformity, they are engaging in an act of defiance. And these small acts, when multiplied across a population, create the foundation for broader resistance. Hope is not just found in grand, dramatic acts of defiance but in everyday decisions to think critically. The way people consume media, the way they engage in discussions, the way they react to pressure to conform, these all shape the degree to which a society is controlled. When people demand transparency from their leaders, when they support independent journalism, when they refuse to let fear dictate their actions, they are chipping away at the structures of control. No authoritarian regime has ever been able to fully suppress free thought, and no attempt to control a population has ever been entirely successful. Even in the most repressive societies, underground networks of resistance have always existed, whether through banned books, secret meetings, or coded messages. Technology, despite its role in surveillance and social conditioning, also provides avenues for resistance. The same internet that enables mass data collection also allows for the rapid spread of information. While major platforms can censor content, decentralized networks, encrypted communication, and independent media provide alternatives. The rise of blockchain technology, whistleblower platforms, and censorship-resistant forums suggests that as control mechanisms become more sophisticated, so too do the tools to evade them. This cat-and-mouse game between control and resistance is a testament to Orwell's belief that thought, once freed, cannot easily be recontained. Another source of hope lies in generational shifts. While older generations may be more entrenched in traditional narratives, younger generations, raised with access to vast amounts of information, often develop a natural skepticism toward authority. This does not mean they are immune to manipulation, far from it, but it does mean they are less likely to accept a singular version of reality without question. The increasing push for transparency in government, corporate accountability, and decentralized power structures reflects this broader trend toward skepticism of centralized control. Orwell's own life was an example of resilience in the face of oppression. Despite experiencing censorship, political exile, and health issues, he continued to write, to challenge, and to expose the dangers of authoritarianism. His work has endured not because it was mandated by any government or institution, but because people found truth in it. This is perhaps the most profound message of all: truth has a way of surviving, even against the most powerful efforts to suppress it. Ideas cannot be imprisoned in the same way people can, as long as there are individuals willing to challenge power, willing to document reality as it is rather than as those in power want it to be. There is hope. The fight against control is not won through a single revolution or a dramatic overthrow of power. It is won in the small moments when people choose to see rather than look away. It is in the refusal to accept convenient lies, in the courage to speak even when silence is safer, in the willingness to stand alone rather than blindly follow the crowd. Orwell's vision was dark, but it was not without light. The fact that his works are still read, still debated, and still influencing minds decades after his death proves that no system of control is absolute. Awareness is a form of resistance, and as long as people remain aware, the battle for freedom is never truly lost. Freedom and security have always existed in a delicate balance. But what happens when the illusion of security is used as a tool for control? Orwell's vision was not just a warning about the loss of political freedoms, but about the psychological mechanisms that make people willingly surrender their autonomy in exchange for comfort, predictability, and the absence of perceived threats. The choice between freedom and safety is not always obvious because true oppression rarely presents itself as outright tyranny. Instead, it creeps in through small, seemingly reasonable compromises, each one making the next more acceptable until people find themselves in a system they would have once resisted. The most effective form of control is one where people do not even realize they're being controlled. The reality is that most people prefer stability over uncertainty, even when that stability comes at the cost of personal liberty. Governments and institutions understand this well, and they craft narratives that frame restrictions as necessary safeguards. The more fearful people become of crime, terrorism, disease, economic collapse, the more willing they are to accept regulations that they would have otherwise rejected. After 9/11, mass surveillance was justified as a means of preventing further attacks, and many citizens not only accepted it but defended it. During the COVID-19 pandemic, governments implemented sweeping emergency measures that gave them unprecedented control over public behavior, all under the guise of safety. Whether these measures were justified or not is secondary to the fact that once freedoms are given up in a moment of crisis, they are rarely fully restored. History is filled with examples of societies that traded liberty for security, only to regret it once they realized how difficult it was to reclaim what they had lost. The Roman Republic collapsed into dictatorship because people feared instability more than they feared authoritarian rule. The rise of Nazi Germany was facilitated by a population that accepted extreme government control as a way to restore order after economic and social turmoil. In each case, the people did not think they were choosing oppression, they thought they were choosing safety. The same pattern repeats throughout history because human psychology does not change. People are more willing to tolerate injustice when they believe it is necessary for the greater good. And by the time they realize they have been manipulated, it is often too late. In the modern world, The erosion of freedom is often subtle, wrapped in the language of progress, security, and social responsibility. Many people assume that if oppression were happening, they would recognize it immediately. There would be soldiers in the streets, mass arrests, and outright censorship. But true control does not work that way. Instead, it operates through surveillance cameras on every street corner, through the gradual normalization of speech restrictions, through algorithms that dictate what news people see and what ideas they are exposed to. It works through economic incentives that punish those who refuse to conform and social pressures that discourage people from questioning dominant narratives. People comply not because they are forced to, but because non-compliance becomes too inconvenient, too costly, or too isolating. One of the greatest deceptions is the idea that freedom and security are mutually exclusive. In reality, a society that is truly secure is one that values individual liberty because freedom fosters innovation, accountability, and resilience. The illusion of security that comes from extreme control is just that, an illusion. The more power governments and corporations have over daily life, the more fragile a society becomes. When people are discouraged from questioning authority, from making independent decisions, from taking risks, they become passive, dependent, and unable to adapt when real challenges arise. A world that prioritizes security above all else becomes a world where people are so afraid of making mistakes that they stop thinking for themselves altogether. The most insidious part of this process is that many people do not feel oppressed, they feel protected. They convince themselves that as long as they can still watch their favorite shows, buy their favorite products, and express their opinions within certain acceptable boundaries, they are free. But this is not real freedom. It is a carefully curated experience designed to give the impression of choice while keeping people within predefined limits. Just as a caged bird may believe it is safe because it is fed regularly and protected from predators, people may mistake their restricted existence for genuine security. The cage is invisible because it has been built over time, piece by piece, until stepping outside of it no longer feels like an option. Orwell understood that the most effective way to control a society is to convince people that they are not being controlled at all. This is why modern authoritarianism does not rely on brute force but on psychological conditioning. People do not need to be physically imprisoned when their minds are shaped in a way that makes them police themselves. They do not need to be explicitly told what they can or cannot do when social norms, economic incentives, and carefully crafted narratives already dictate acceptable behavior. The moment people start questioning these structures, the illusion begins to crack. But this requires effort, an effort that many are unwilling to make because questioning the world around them is uncomfortable. It forces them to confront the possibility that much of what they have believed, accepted, and complied with was built on deception. Resistance does not always mean revolution. It starts with awareness. It starts with refusing to accept narratives at face value, with asking uncomfortable questions, with recognizing that freedom is not just the absence of physical chains but the presence of true autonomy. It means understanding that security should never come at the expense of fundamental rights. Because a society that prioritizes comfort over liberty will eventually lose both. It means being willing to face uncertainty rather than accept prepackaged answers designed to keep people passive. Orwell's greatest warning was not just about oppressive governments but about the willingness of people to accept their own subjugation when it is presented in the right way. The future is not predetermined. Orwell did not write his books to dictate what would happen, but to show what could happen if people were not vigilant. The question is not whether society will inevitably become more controlled, more surveilled, more restricted. It is whether people will notice and push back before it is too late. The choice is not just between freedom and oppression, but between awareness and ignorance, between courage and complacency. Will people continue to live in a world where their choices are shaped for them? Or will they take back the power to define their own reality? The answer lies not in what governments and corporations do, but in what individuals are willing to accept. True security comes not from giving up freedom but from embracing it fully, despite the risks, despite the uncertainty, because without freedom, security is nothing more than a comfortable cage. So now that we've peeled back the layers of deception, the question remains: what will you do with this knowledge? Because make no mistake, this is not just an abstract discussion about Orwell or some distant dystopian future. This is happening right now, in real time, all around you. Every time you accept a carefully framed narrative without question. Every time you choose comfort over truth. Every time you allow yourself to be funneled into a choice that was never really yours to begin with. You reinforce the very system that seeks to control you. But awareness is the first step toward change. The moment you begin to see the mechanisms of control, they start to lose their power. Orwell warned us, but he also left us with a glimmer of hope, because true control can never be absolute. As long as there are those who think freely, who refuse to conform, who dare to ask uncomfortable questions, the illusion of control will never be complete. That means you have a choice. Will you continue living in the dream, content with the illusion, or will you wake up and start seeing the world for what it really is? This isn't just about governments or corporations or algorithms, this is about you. About all of us, and about whether we choose to reclaim our freedom or let it slip away. Piece by piece, until there's nothing left to fight for. If this video resonated with you, don't let the conversation end here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below. What do you think? Are we truly free, or just playing along in someone else's game? And if you want to support independent content that challenges the system, consider leaving a super thanks or donating through the links in the description. Your support not only helps this channel grow but also ensures that these ideas continue to reach more people. Remember, the greatest weapon against control is knowledge. And now that you know, what will you do with it? I'll see you in the next video. Stay awake, stay aware, stay free.